Welcome to the Forum, live-streamed worldwide from the Leadership Studio at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. I'm Dean Michelle Williams. The Forum is a collaboration between the Harvard Chan School and independent news media. Each program features a panel of experts addressing some of today's most pressing public health issues. The Forum is one way the school advances the frontiers of public health and makes scientific insights accessible to policymakers and the public. I hope you find this program engaging and informative. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome. My name is Caroline Humer. I'm a correspondent. I work for Reuters, and I'm your moderator today. We're here today to discuss U.S. drug prices. Why are they so high? The U.S. spends the most per capita on prescription drugs compared to other high-income countries, according to a 2017 Commonwealth Fund report. Companies that astronomically hike prices on some drugs, such as the infamous 5,000% increase on the antibiotic Daraprim in 2015, grab headlines. And some Americans are still struggling to cope with their medical expenses. Sometimes they skip their prescriptions altogether, or they ration it and take less than the recommended dosage. Yet, U.S. prescription drug spending as a share of total national health expenditures is in keeping with other countries. So what's going on, and why does it matter for public health? To help us unpack the complicated picture, we've brought together an esteemed panel, and starting from my immediate right, I'll introduce them. We have Aaron Kesselheim. He's Associate Professor of Medicine, Harvard Medical School, Brigham and Women's Hospital, and Director of the Program on Regulation, Therapeutics, and Law. To his right is Richard Frank. He's Professor of Health Economics in the Department of Healthcare Policy at Harvard Medical School. Next to him is Stephen Pearson, President of the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. And at the end is Limor Daphne. She's a professor of business administration at the Harvard Business School. Today's event is being presented jointly with Reuters, and it is part of the Dr. Lawrence H. and Roberta Cohn Forums. We're pleased to welcome the Cohn family today. Thank you. We're streaming on the websites live now on the Forum and on Reuters. We're also streaming on Facebook and on Reuters TV. The program will include a brief Q&A, and so you could email questions to the forum at hsph.harvard.edu, and you can participate in a live chat that's happening right now on the Forum website. So, prescription drug costs have entered the political arena. In May, President Trump unveiled a blueprint meant to address lowering drug prices. Let's take a look at the announcement.
Today, my administration is launching the most sweeping action in history to lower the price of prescription drugs for the American people. We've wanted to be doing this. We've been working on it right from day one. It's been a complicated process, but not too complicated. And today it's happening. We will have tougher negotiation, more competition, and much lower prices at the pharmacy counter. And it'll start to take effect very soon. My administration has already taken significant steps to get drug prices under control. We reformed the drug discount program for safety net hospitals to save senior citizens hundreds of millions of dollars on drugs this year alone. We're also increasing competition and reducing regulatory burdens so drugs can be gotten to the market quicker and cheaper. We're very much eliminating the middlemen. The middlemen became very, very rich. Right? Whoever those middlemen were, and a lot of people never even figured it out, they're rich.
Well, despite this announcement, a Politico Harvard Chan poll this summer showed that just over 27% of adults had heard or read about the blueprint. And among those who were aware, about 4 in 10 think that it will lower prices. And in 2018, recent reporting shows that drug prices are still rising. So as we will hear, the blueprint is not the only plan in town. The Democratic proposals call for giving Medicare the power to directly negotiate with drug manufacturers. That would open the door to cheaper Canadian imports as well. And they want to impose fines on drug makers for the kinds of dramatic price hikes that have made headlines. So let's get into it a little bit and start with Aaron. Can you describe the prescription price setting landscape in the U.S.?
Sure. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be on this panel, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. So prescription drug costs in the United States make up about a $450 billion market and take up about 20% or so of healthcare dollars, and some private payers are indicating that they now account for about a quarter of all their spending. And prescription drug spending in general is driven by brand name drug prices, which brand name drugs make up about 10% of prescriptions, but 75% of prescription drug spending overall. And the sort of fundamental reason why brand name prescription drugs are so costly is that the drugs are priced at whatever the market will bear. That's the sort of general fundamental principle for drug pricing in the United States. And in fact, the market bears a substantial amount, and that's because it's a very inefficient and ineffective market, and I just want to sort of focus on a couple reasons why that is. So first of all, there is a fundamental disconnect between the physicians that are prescribing the drug and the patients that are then taking and paying for the drug. And oftentimes physicians don't know what drugs cost. And then many patients have prescription drug insurance to cover the costs of their products, so they only are exposed to a small amount of the cost of the product. And many patients then also therefore don't know necessarily what the full cost of a drug is. And then of course, when you talk about the insurance and the payer market for prescription drugs, there is a range of different payers that we use in the United States to pay for drugs. There are government payers like Medicare and Medicaid, and we have various laws in place that restrict the ability of those kinds of payers to negotiate with pharmaceutical manufacturers. And then there are, of course, private payers as well. And they try to negotiate individually through systems of complex, confidential rebates and other mechanisms, and that is not necessarily a very effective mechanism. And so, fundamentally, what we have, the prescription drugs, brand name prescription drugs, are protected by patents. They're monopoly markets, and we don't have an effective way of negotiating on the other side of that in order to provide a counterweight. And so I think what we'll talk about a little bit today are some of the mechanisms that we could use to better do that. But the sort of minor changes that are mentioned by Trump in the blueprint are not necessarily going to get at that fundamental issue until and we're going to need to take some much more substantial steps, because the outcome of all of this inefficiency and these high prices is that patients have trouble affording the essential medications that they need. And so price-related medication non-adherence, when patients don't take the essential medications they're prescribed, is way too prevalent in the United States. It leads to worse patient outcomes. People with diabetes are unable to afford the insulin that they need. Patients with cancer are unable to afford the cancer drugs that they need, and that will help them. And so, I think that presents a sort of an ethical imperative to try to take care of this issue.
Thanks, Aaron. It does sound complicated. Richard, you have talked about diagnosing the problem of high drug prices. What's your assessment of what's going on?
Well, like Aaron, competition actually does a pretty good job at harnessing the prices when it's there. And the question is, why isn't it there more often? The place that it doesn't do well is when people are almost completely covered by their insurance, so that they don't pay very much out of pocket, and where there isn't much competition, either due to a patent monopoly or due to some variety of other either regulatory factors or market factors that keep competitors off the market. And so when you have people that are fully insured facing a monopoly where they don't have a choice, an alternative essentially, you have a recipe for high prices and rapidly growing prices. The Medicare Part D program, which is the place where everybody's focused on for negotiation, is sort of a really interesting example of this. In a sense, it consists of two pieces. One piece is you have specialty pharmaceutical insurance companies competing to cover people, and they in turn negotiate with prescription drug makers for prices. And if they pay more for a drug, that comes out of their pocket. That comes out of their bottom line. There's a second part to Medicare Part D, which is what people refer to as the reinsurance part. And there, patients pay about 5% of the cost. These prescription drug plans, these specialty insurers pay about 15%, and the government picks up 80%. So they are very little on the hook for that extra cost of a drug, and therefore, in those circumstances, the incentive to fight hard for good prices is dramatically weakened. And so, again, what you see is very high prices in that section of the benefit. And in fact, the entire growth of the program, well, not the entire growth, but almost the entire growth of the program over the last, say, 8 or 9 years has been due to the growth in that reinsurance part of the program, where, in fact, the competition is most likely to break down. And it actually turns out to be a relatively small number of drugs that are generating all the costs. In Medicare, 90% of the prescriptions are for generics, and generic drugs continue to fall in price for the most part, with some exceptions like the one you noted. But there's about probably 10, 20 drugs, maybe 25 drugs, where that cost more than $1,000 a month, and that's where the problem really is. And so that has been the focus of a lot of policy attention.
Thank you. Stephen, let's dig a little bit deeper and talk a little bit about, these brand name drugs, how they're priced here, how they're priced in Europe. What's the difference there, and what's going on?
Sure, there's a big difference. I mean, when a new drug is approved by the FDA, not all the time, but we often have the chance to celebrate science and an achievement that will really benefit patients. And that does capture a fair amount of media. But what's interesting is that every time that happens, something else has occurred either that day or in and around that time. And that's that kind of uniquely in an economy, a company gets to name its price. And that price is the price that the government will pay for what that company has developed without any direct negotiation. Now, to be fair, the prices are thought about for years, and then kind of a final phase happens just before the launch. And companies do have to think about the competitive landscape. So, if they want a certain amount of market share, just like any other kind of, marketplace, they have to think about how their price will compete given its relative advantages for patients versus another drug. The reason that hasn't led to a lot of control on costs, certainly compared to Europe, is because drugs are not easy to walk away from. It's not like a cell phone or a car where you can go next door and get a different brand, and it's essentially the same thing, and you can make your own trade-offs. Drugs really do have slightly different characteristics, and so we as patients and we as physicians, we as health systems want to make a broad variety of the developed drugs available. So that tilts the kind of the dynamics of the market, if you will, on top of having a patent system that at launch will give a company, again, a certain number of years during which it may have the landscape entirely to itself. So think of name your price as a simple, overly simplistic, but that's kind of the way it happens in the US. The reason that they don't charge $10 million is because Congress would probably get a whiff of that and want to have a special hearing, and the whole system might come crumbling down. Europe does it differently, and I'm using Europe very, obviously stereotypically, but it's every other developed country. So you can start at the South Pole and go to the North Pole. Many middle and developing countries also have some system of doing three things, and like any good slogan, it rhymes. They aggregate the buying power, they evaluate the clinical and cost effectiveness, and they negotiate. So they aggregate, evaluate, and negotiate. Aggregation means that they pool basically either in a national health insurance system or by cobbling together the existing private market in very specific ways to have basically all the weight of having all the patients or all the members of a country be kind of have the weight of that in the negotiation, so that you can say, well, we will, if we pick your drug and we do, make your drug more available, it's going to get a lot of uptake, whereas if we don't, you're really going to hurt in this country. So that lends to a different dynamic in negotiation. They evaluate the evidence. Every other developed country has a federal institute or agency that takes a close look at the comparative clinical effectiveness of drugs at or near the time of launch to help inform that process of what comes next, which is negotiation. And negotiation looks very differently in different countries. It really does. They have different structures. But ultimately, the key part about negotiation is that these countries are willing to stick with it. They're willing, in some cases, to say no. If the price doesn't seem to mean that it's a reasonable value for them and it's affordable, they are willing to play hardball. And you can have some very famous examples. One going on right now is around cystic fibrosis drugs in many different European countries. There's a real roadblock going on between governments and the manufacturer. So they aggregate, they evaluate, and they negotiate, and they mean the last phase to have teeth. And I think that's one of the biggest differences that I see in how drugs are priced in the US versus in Europe.
Thanks. Lee Moore, Richard spoke a little bit before about how consumers in the government programs are protected by the structure. You have also researched the impact of rising drug costs on consumers and surprisingly found that many consumers in commercial plans, ones offered by employers or other institutions, may not be feeling the hit of these higher drug prices in the way that we think they are. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure, absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me here today. And I'm going to echo some of the themes that have already been mentioned. But a very little known fact is that the share that consumers are spending for their drugs today is actually lower than it was over 10 years ago. And in fact, I looked up the statistics this morning, national health expenditures, and discovered that the absolute dollar amount that we are spending out of pocket for retail prescription drugs has gone down. Okay, so that is true in spite of the fact that prices are going up. And I'm not just talking list prices, I'm saying spending is in fact going up. And I believe that this protection of sheltering consumers, just as Richard mentioned, sheltering consumers from the actual cost of these medications is part of what is driving the growth in prices. And there are various mechanisms that pharmaceutical companies can employ to shelter consumers, including co-payment coupons for the commercially insured, patient assistance programs for Medicare enrollees, and those are mechanisms that tamp down the demand sensitivity to prices. Now, that's not the only component. Another component is then it disables the ability of pharmaceutical benefit managers to try to negotiate for better prices in exchange for preferred tier placement on their formularies, because if I'm not paying much out of pocket because I have a coupon I can use, then I don't really care if it's a tier 4 drug, and therefore that manufacturer just wants to make sure that the drug is on the formulary, but it is sort of indifferent to the pressure, doesn't have pressure to keep the price low. And so I'm currently trying to do some research to try to quantify the effect of these programs in driving prices up, but I believe it's significant. There are two other factors that I'm hoping to mention mention in addition. One is was echoed previously, which is big. There are some really high-priced drugs without strong therapeutic substitutes that are driving high spending. And in the past, we've benefited from generic entry when we were talking about chemical compounds, bringing down the prices of drugs. But now these drugs are primarily biologic compounds, and we haven't seen the same entry of biosimilars in the United States or adoption of biosimilars, let alone any of the willingness to take hard bargaining stances, as Steve Pearson has mentioned. So that's, I think, another key driver of what we're seeing today. And last, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss it in somewhat greater detail as the panel continues, but there are a fair number of strategies that the pharmaceutical manufacturers employ, which FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb called shenanigans. These are attempts to shield their products from competition and also to evergreen their products and create new formulations, but at the same time avoid competition from generics. And all of these are really important factors in causing higher spending, even if consumers are not themselves shouldering out of pocket a greater share of that spending.
Thanks, Leemore. We will get back to talking about those shenanigans for sure. So we've heard a lot about the drivers of drug prices, and now we're going to hear from a patient. This is Pam Holt, and this video comes from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
My name is Pamela Holt. I'm a retired teacher. I have, in this last year, had to pay over $10,000 in medical costs for my drug to keep me alive. I was a newly retired principal at an elementary school and feeling pretty good about retirement. Just kind of out of the blue was diagnosed with multiple myeloma. I had one drug specifically that was very costly. Without the drug I am on, my survival rate is much less. I need the drug. I thought I had a comfortable retirement being an educator and having Social Security, but it turned out that this drug was more than I could handle on my income. It became very costly for me to the point where just recently I had to refinance my home. It's impacted my life seriously. I have 8 grandchildren. I really would like to spoil them and take them places and do things with them. I can't do that. I would love to see action done that would help generics to come on the market, because that would help me personally. And I feel strongly that drug companies are just gouging patients who are dying.
American Patients First, hhs.gov/drug pricing. Produced by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services at taxpayer expense.
Okay, well, let's talk now about ways that we can address these drug prices. What can be done, what is already being done. I think a good place to start here would be with that Trump blueprint that we referenced at the beginning. That was announced in July. There's about 6 weeks until the midterm elections, and wondering if anyone on our panel might just address, whether or not anything has come from that, or if we should be expecting anything from it in the next 6 weeks that could, answer some of these issues for people like Pam Holt. Anyone?
Well, so I'll start, but so I think, I think we all support Pam Holt and want to see her do the same sorts of and want to have the same kinds of goals that she has in trying to get drug prices to a reasonable level. The blueprint itself had a lot of ideas in it. It had a lot of ideas at a very sort of high, vague level. There weren't a lot of specifics about particular interventions. There were a lot of questions that were asked it seemed like the government was just trying to get information. There were some good ideas, and then there were some ideas that are probably useless or bad ideas. And so I don't necessarily think that this is a strategy or a clear path forward for trying to address these issues. But I do want to point out one of the positive issues that was mentioned in the blueprint, and that was mentioned earlier by Limor, is the idea of getting competition onto the market at a reasonable time. And the only kind of competition that substantially and consistently lowers drug prices in the U.S. is competition from interchangeable generic drugs. And so when there are very expensive biologic molecules where you don't have that same kind of interchangeable competition, then you can get high prices extended out indefinitely. And so, to the extent that the blueprint talked about it as an aspirational goal to try to get more interchangeable competition on the market, I think that was one of the positive ideas that was in that document.
Okay, and that competition, it sounds, Limor, like you're talking about some shenanigans that prevent that from happening. Maybe you could just share that with us.
Before I go to shenanigans, though we love to talk about them with good reason, I just want to piggyback on something that Aaron just mentioned, which is the potential to see more competition in the biologic space and what actions the administration could possibly take to promote that. And he touched on this issue of interchangeability, and that's really the engine of success for generic drugs, because you get a prescription from your physician, you go to the pharmacy can automatically substitute it for a generic compound and for any manufacturer of that compound. The FDA has so far chosen to reject calling biosimilars by the same non-proprietary name as the biologic reference product. And so that change in the naming guidance would help with this interchangeability that was referenced, and the FDA also could release guidance on what is going to count as interchangeable and ideally not make it as onerous as they've suggested in the past. So there are actions that could be taken to foster greater competition in that space. There are also actions that the manufacturers themselves, the shenanigans that we talked about, employ in order to maximize profits. And one of those that has gotten a lot of attention of late is choosing to withhold samples of their products from manufacturers seeking to copy them. And you can understand competitively why they would want to do that, but the rationale is that these manufacturers don't have a proper prescription for having this medication, and it might fall into the wrong hands, and then the manufacturer might be responsible for anybody who's mishandled or misused the drugs. And there's been many statements by public officials saying that the law was specifically designed to enable manufacturers to have to try to copy these medications, and the pharmaceutical industry continues to resist legislation that would explicitly require the samples to be provided at market prices.
Just to skip back for a second to that interchangeability, is there any indication that the FDA, that the Commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, is leaning towards the idea of interchangeability in the new policies coming this fall?
You want to take that?
You want me to take that?
Sure.
Okay. This has been a debate that's been going on since 2010 within the administration. The Affordable Care Act, within the Affordable Care Act, was all the authority you need for the FDA commissioner to, one, define interchangeability and set the guidance for doing that, provide proprietary names, and even more importantly, set up a sort of rapid process for review. And all of those have been very sluggish. Moreover, on the payment side, what you could imagine being done and was proposed was to put all of these drugs under one price, under one code. And so therefore, if you have a cheap drug and a high drug, you get a much better deal if you go for the biosimilar, the generic in this case. That hasn't happened, and that's also not so much an FDA problem, but a Center for Medicare and Medicaid problem. But all of those things are within the authorities of the administration and would have a dramatic effect on competition.
So to look a little bit at competition, one of the things that comes up a lot, Steve, for you, I think, is where should these drugs be priced at in the first place, and what are they actually worth? What is the value of them? Can you maybe just talk a little bit about the idea of an independent evaluation and how that might help fix the problem in the U.S. with these prices?
Sure. Well, as we've all been talking about, and as you mentioned, this is a complex system, so there's no one silver bullet. No matter what you think it might be, it's going to have to be a real sustained thrust with lots of different features having to do with competition and other aspects as well. So I mentioned the way that drugs are kind of new brand drugs have been priced. It's kind of what I hope will be viewed as old school more rapidly than not, because a very common way to think about how the price should be kind of aligned with the benefit to patients is to measure that. I mean, we get a lot of that data from the trials that are used to get FDA approval. We find out whether the drugs are, extend the length of life for patients or improve their quality of life. Sometimes that's by having fewer side effects or whatever it might be. Now you can kind of just do a gestalt and say, well, it seems a little bit better or a lot better. But you can actually, do cost effectiveness analysis, which really tries to measure it in a quantified way, not just in the short term, but really over the long term. So we capture the real long-term benefits to patients and the long-term possibilities that even if it's expensive up front, it might reduce hospitalizations or doctor's visits or other things that will kind of balance that out. So you wrap that all together, and you can scale a price at how much higher it should be than our best current care if something is better by how much better it is. And you scale it to the wealth of the country. So we would actually, one of your questions is, why are the prices high in the US? We're a very wealthy country. For a given gain in health, we would pay more in this country than they would in a poor country. That's kind of okay. So it doesn't bother me to see lower prices in some countries. It's basically their ability to pay, their willingness to pay given their other societal needs. Well, we do have other societal needs too. We have education and defense and the environment, so we can't spend everything on health. So again, you scale up the price so that you get a reasonable additional cost for an added health gain. And that's a really good place to start, I think, in part because it sends the right signals to manufacturers. We want you to go out and hit a home run for patients. We want you to demonstrate that it really improves their quality of life or length of life. We're going to handsomely reward you if you do. But if you come to us with this much and it's smudgy around the borders and you haven't done good studies, and we're still in a system where you can name your own price, again, that should be obsolete. The fact that you could charge us a lot more even though it's just like this. And we don't have many options to do something else. So I'm hoping that we're moving, and I think we are seeing some movement, not at the federal government level yet necessarily, but in the private system and some of the state Medicaid programs. I think we're starting to see some movement towards seeing pricing as a way to reflect the added benefit to patients as a good anchor from which to start.
I mean, if I could just summarize what you said, that the manufacturers do think a lot about the prices that they set, right. but the purchasers, they don't think very much about the prices they're willing to pay. And until
I would say that's because even if traditionally, if they said, I'd like to pay $100 for this, but the company's charging me $200, the time they put into figuring out that 100 wasn't worth too much because they're going to have to pay 200 anyway. That's part of the problem.
And the reason they're going to have to is they're not willing to make trade-offs and evaluate what's the value added of this medication, and this is how much it's worth to us. We don't see a variety of products on the market. An older formulation of insulin, newer formulation with different prices, and then choices for physicians and their patients. So we're the demand side side is very inelastic. So of course they end up paying.
That's true.
And not only are they, I think that more than that are not willing to make those choices, I think that sometimes they're not able to make those choices. We have laws and rules about about not excluding certain drugs from formularies. There are, various states have laws about coverage of certain drugs, and when you have rules about the way that Medicare and Medicaid is implemented that forces insurers to cover all of these products, then yeah, they could say, great, I'd love to pay only $100, but the manufacturer says, well, the law says you have to cover it, and we have a patent, so we're the only manufacturer that's making the product, and so we say it's $200, and that's what you're going to pay us.
And I think that one drug we could talk about along those lines is Humira. It's the biggest drug in the U.S. Their global sales are $19 billion. There is competition, more or less. There are other drugs out there to treat the same things. It's the biggest drug for government spending. And I know, Richard, that you have looked a little bit at the issues. This is a drug that the price goes up every year in the double digits. It hasn't stopped. That's driven it up to basically, I think it's over $10,000 now a year for that drug. And, what are some of the ways that the government, as such a big spender and big payer, can harness its power or change the way it's buying drugs like this to reduce the cost?
Yeah, so I think going back to the beginning, there are really a limited number of drugs out there that are really high cost, that have little or no competition that you could focus on for negotiation. And the question is, how do you do that? And because you have, in a sense, two problems. You need to have a system set up that sorts things out when there's disagreement. And you have to have some protection that you're not going to drive the cost, the price so low that, in fact, there won't be any incentive for innovation. And there won't be an ability to make enough money to get a reasonable return. And so there have been several ideas put forth. One of them has been binding arbitration. And we use that for a lot of other necessary services in this country, like when police and firemen have a labor dispute over wages, they're not allowed to strike. So what you do instead is you submit to binding arbitration. And there are rules that define that. So that would be, well, and we do it in the most important products, which is the NFL. And we sort things out that way there. So that would be one way. Another way would be to, in a sense, have a methodology set out along the lines that Steve might design to set a fallback price. And if there isn't agreement, then there would be some analysis done that would then define a fallback price. But that wouldn't be known until after the negotiations failed, so that everybody would have an incentive to come together and negotiate a fair price.
Does that seem possible, Steve? Could we get to that?
Anything's possible depending on how how challenging the budget issues become and how much political pressure is focused on any one particular area. There's a lot going on in Washington any day of the week or month, but prescription drugs are particularly kind of relevant because over 50% of Americans take them every day. And it's something that touches our families both clinically and in their pocketbook. So the problem is also that we all want innovation. We all want the next great CAR-T drug that's going to take a pediatric cancer patient who is going to die in 6 months and is giving them 2-3 years more. Maybe it's a cure. I mean, these are things that don't happen with every new drug, but we have to make sure that we have the resources to handsomely reward and incentivize those kinds of home runs and not squander them where we fail to discriminate, as I was talking about before. So I do think, one thing, when you hear about Medicare negotiation, it does actually sound easy on the surface, but once you get even one layer down, it gets really tricky. Does that mean that Medicare would have one national formulary and kick one drug out of the market entirely to get the best price on another one? If so, if they've got that much power, why wouldn't they have, as you said, maybe run the risk of driving the price down too low? Because there's always more money to save if you drive the price down lower and if you're the only game in town. So We are uniquely American in all good and maybe questionable ways, but the idea of a national formulary is hotly debated even in progressive circles. So arbitration is an interesting alternative, or other options in which we try to let the free market work, but again, I've heard about it called baseball arbitration, where the two sides come together and the ultimate arbitrator can't split the difference. They have to pick one offer or the other at the end of the day, and that means that everybody has to be as reasonable as possible. And more likely than not, in that situation, I think the companies will really refer to data on how well their drugs help patients. They won't make vague claims about needing a high price to sustain future innovation. They'll really kind of get down to how well their drugs really work. And the payers will probably do something quite similar. So it all depends on the budgetary, how many years before we go broke in Medicare and other ways. But with an aging baby boomer population, with fantastic innovation in the pipeline, just without a doubt, the science, the genetic science is coming to fruition. I think we're going to have to figure out some new ways forward, because what we want is a grand bargain. We want a fair price, and we want that drug to be accessible so Pamela Holt doesn't have to pay $10,000 each year out of her own pocket for it. And we're not there yet. So I really hope we wake up in 5 years and we've achieved one way or the other some kind of grand bargain, because that's the way that's going to help real patients.
And so far, those kinds of arrangements between payers and drug companies have been very limited to a few drugs where it's well known that the drugs are working well. So there's quite a road ahead to that. And in the meanwhile, it seems that pharma companies are doubling down even on their copay coupon policies to try to make the drugs more affordable for patients. And Limor, I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how those programs affect people's price sensitivity, how it affects this pricing, and what could or should change there as well.
Sure. Well, I think that the regulators need to give a further thought to the policies vis-a-vis copay coupons and patient assistance programs, because having the manufacturers of medications who are responsible for setting the prices also be the ones who are issuing coupons and or making tax-deductible donations to foundations that then turn around and help patients bear their cost-sharing component of the drugs is like having a fox guard the hen house. So if these copayment coupons are banned for Medicare and Medicaid, although they have low copayments, but Medicare enrollees, and the reason is they're viewed as kickbacks. They're not banned for commercial enrollees, and I personally was able to do a study on one particular kind of coupon, which are coupons for branded molecules when there are generic bioequivalents available, and unsurprisingly, availability of the coupons leads to increase in utilization of the branded drugs, doesn't actually increase total utilization of the molecule or any evidence of improved adherence, does increase spending substantially. That's just the tip of the iceberg. That's just when there's an identical copy of the drug available. A bigger issue is when there are a variety of drugs without perfect bioequivalence, and the coupons prevent us from really caring how much the drug is priced. And some of these programs will pay all of your deductible, and you've probably heard some stories about how some insurers are fighting back and saying, you know what, if somebody else pays your deductible, it's not going to count. These copay accumulator programs, not going to count towards your deductible. And partly, why should a patient who takes a drug that has a coupon not have to foot her deductible when another patient who has to have expensive treatments that don't have coupons does? So there's inequity in that, and you can, just even thinking about this, you can imagine that it's entirely broken. So the one thing in the Trump pricing plan that kind of surprised me was to see mention that maybe these copay coupons should be permitted for Medicare enrollees, because that would very likely lead to more price inflation and higher prices. So I'm kind of puzzled by that one.
And I guess one of the parts of this new copay back and forth between the payer and the drug company is the consumer in the middle. So have you noticed that has increased their exposure if suddenly the deductible is not covered by the drug company? It seems like one day you're not paying anything and the next you are.
Right. I mean, certainly consumers, it's the coincidence of the deductibles and the rising prices of drugs that has got this topic in the news so much because, as I said before, the stats show that we aren't spending more out of pocket, but it's very visible to us because we have the deductible. So there is some pressure on the manufacturers, and if the insurers implement these accumulator programs where they don't allow the manufacturers to offset the spending, then we might we get a little bit more demand sensitivity. But the consumers in the middle, let me just be clear, that isn't really the optimal way to go. We don't actually want chronically ill patients to be like, Pam Holt having to, we don't want them to be any more disadvantaged than they already are. So ideally, we wouldn't have a one-size-fits-all policy. We would have value-based co-payments, and we'd have, patients with chronic diseases taking high-value drugs at very low cost to them.
Great, thanks. Lisa, do you have any questions?
Caroline, thanks. Yes, we have a number of them coming in right now. So let's start with this one from Jacob Towell, who's with the Special Committee on Aging with the U.S. Senate. Are we seeing the European Federal Institute's agencies you mentioned take U.S. prices into account while evaluating cost effectiveness of a new drug, specifically for specialty medications, but also in the entire space?
I should probably take that on. No, they, basically when you do a cost effectiveness analysis, you would want to take the costs in your own healthcare system. Actually, even sometimes the drugs would be compared to a different kind of best standard of care in a different country. It can differ from what you see in the U.S. So they would not, they're aware that our prices are in general higher, but it doesn't factor into their own consideration. A few countries do a kind of a crosswalk just to make sure how their prices ultimately compare to a basket of other developed countries. To my understanding, for a while the U.S. was part of that basket for some countries like Canada, but because our prices have become so high, they've tended to kick the U.S. out of their comparator because they don't want to falsely peg themselves to a higher price. So they tend to peg themselves to other countries where the pricing is more in line with their own.
Great, thank you. We'll take some from online and then we can check about the studio audience here. Let's see, I guess this might be a question for Richard. What are your thoughts on the 6 protected drug classes in Part D? Do you think these should be eliminated?
The answer is some. The 6 protected classes in Part D touch on HIV drugs, psychotropic drugs, and the original idea behind them is that they were at that time mostly branded, and they were different enough from one another, and the responses of patients who were different enough, and that you didn't know it till they had taken the drug, that people were hesitant to sort of allow for aggressive formularies to be applied in those areas. The world has changed since then. For example, antidepressants are now mostly generic. So there's, you don't need to go one way or the other on that one because there's lots of competition there now. But to the extent that you wanted to try to drive things down a little bit further, it's probably not necessary anymore to have a protected class there. For antipsychotics, it may be a little bit different. And so, I think when you start getting there, you're talking about extraordinarily vulnerable populations where there's a tremendous amount of harm that can be done from the wrong classes. But in principle, you'd like to have as few of those as you possibly could.
Sometimes I just, if you don't mind, if you can imagine the analogy whereby the government, private insurance and Medicare is required, well, let me pick at the Defense Department. What if they were required to buy Lockheed's new airplane at the price that the company decides, no matter how much better it was than the current plane that they're flying? I mean, you can imagine we would just kind of furrow our brow and say, why would any government want to pay for airplanes that way? Now, drugs, as you said, in vulnerable populations are very different. But the economics of creating a market in which you have to cover every single drug, and you can't, in a sense, compete them head to head, and you have to accept the prices as determined by the manufacturer, it's a perfect storm for the rising prices that we tend to see in the U.S.
Yeah, an important thing, though, to note is that there are other tools available. So, for example, you can have various utilization management techniques, prior authorizations, et cetera, applied to those. And so that gives the plans a little bit of negotiating power. But, Steve's largely right. And it's really a matter of how bad are the harms that you can possibly do from being overly restrictive.
And you really diminish access with those.
Right, that's what I meant.
Those programs.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, this is from Sanjeev Shriram. How do we help more Americans understand that they are paying twice for drugs? Once when their taxpayer dollars fund NIH-backed research on for medications, and again when the drug corporations demand exorbitant prices for those medications. Drug corporations are spending more on marketing than R&D. We've had a couple of questions about this, so I know.
So it is the case, and we've done a lot of research in our group on this topic. The key transformational drugs that emerge in the U.S. And around the world originate in many cases from publicly funded sources, and there is a substantial amount of taxpayer investment in not only in the basic science and translational science, but sometimes all the way up into the product development part. And we talked about the CAR-Ts earlier, and those originated in publicly funded science as well. And then what happens is, ultimately when a product emerges and is synthesized, then there's a patent on it, and the pharmaceutical manufacturers then control the patent, and so they're able to control the prices and control much of the revenue that then comes in. And then, the question asker is very true in that, a substantial amount of spending on drugs in the United States comes from Medicare and Medicaid, which are funded by government. Those are government dollars as well. And so, it is the case that there is, a substantial amount of support for a great deal of innovation, particularly the most important key innovation that comes through, and that I think is something that does need to be better recognized, and then also potentially taken into account as we're talking about what a fair price is.
Great, thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? Does anyone want to ask a question?
Hi, my name is Noam. Thank you. Hi, my name is Noam Yousefi. I'm a health policy student here at the Chan School. My question is regarding the European market. A lot of the pushback that we see from pharmaceutical companies, as we said, is that lowering drug prices will stifle innovation. Do we see that happening in European markets? Are we seeing these companies drown, or are they able to remain sustainable and continue innovating even when the government is able to negotiate prices?
Views on that are so across the board. So you've heard, and I've heard passionate, eloquent, informed arguments that we overpay only because the Europeans underpay. I've heard passionate, eloquent responses from economists that, now why exactly, if they paid more, would the companies decide to charge us less? Why wouldn't they keep charging us the same price? Isn't more profit what they're supposed to do? So there's, and on the other hand, I do believe that the ecosystem for innovation is unparalleled in this country. Your ability to raise venture capital, to link up to the NIH science, the best federal funding for basic science in the world, and to get that into the market, into clinical trials, to work with academics. If you talk to people in Europe, they salivate at what we have. So my hope is that there isn't a black and white ultimate answer to this, where we can make this kind of unlimited claim that we need the prices as they are, or even more, to sustain the innovation that we've got, and that any percent off the top will instantly cripple innovation and stifle it. I think there are ways to believe that the companies have generally very high profit margins. There's a lot of risk and a lot of reward, but I think we have a very healthy pharmaceutical industry. And I really do believe that many of them feel that ultimately their strategic interest is in having some more kind of reliable and universal system in which the prices are maintained and kind of scaled in a way that's more sustainable for the economies in which they live. Because otherwise, it's a race to the bottom or the top, depending on how you look at it. And so I think we have some recognition even among the manufacturing community that old school pricing and old school's ways of justifying it just aren't going to cut it going forward.
Can I add some color to that? I think one really important thing to add to this is that a French company like Sanofi, they make money selling here. It's not like they only sell in France and therefore the only thing that's going on is the money they make in France to fund innovation. They sell to the United States. So to the extent that they make a lot of their money here and a lot of their returns here, then that affects the investment in those companies. But it's not because the companies are French or German or Swiss, per se, that their innovation prospects are different.
I also think we should think about what kind of innovation we want. And if their system is set up, as Steve talked about earlier, if the system is set up in the United States that you can make a lot of money with a little bit, basically putting in a little bit of risk to make a very small amount of change to a product, then as a for-profit manufacturer, that's where you're going to invest the lion's share of your money. And so I think we not only need to think about innovation in general, but we need to think about what kind of innovation that we want to try to incentivize and whether or not the system that we have currently set up is incentivizing the right kind of innovation. And unfortunately, I think in many cases it's not.
Caroline, can I return to a question that you asked earlier? Just because
Yes.
Because I know sometimes even after a full hour, it just seems so complicated, right? And the Trump blueprint won't fix it, and nothing else will fix it by itself. So people sometimes can feel this sense of just kind of hopelessness. I just want to mention briefly 2 experiments going on in the Medicaid system and in the private market that shows that I think people are willing to take some risks and experiment. One is the state of New York's Medicaid program. They did pass a law that allows them to create a target spending cap for their drugs within the Medicaid system so that they can make sure they have enough budget for other things. If they're exceeding that spending, they are now allowed to pick out drugs that are contributing to that excess spend and to identify a fair value-based price that they will negotiate down to get an even deeper discount than Medicaid programs usually do. And this is the first example of a public kind of insurer in the United States explicitly using cost effectiveness to help it identify what is a fair price linked to the ability to help patients, and how do we create levers and carrots and sticks and things to try to get us there. Briefly, in the private market, now this is very controversial and it was just announced about 4 to 6 weeks ago. CVS, which is obviously one of the big pharmacy benefit managers, it's also a large self-insured employer. And it decided to change its health insurance for all of its employees, and there are a couple of other companies doing it too, where if after they negotiate to the best of their ability, the drug's price for a new drug that comes out doesn't get down to a fair value-based price, as determined by actually reports from ICE or my institute, then it won't be covered. It's not covered. So this sounds like a European approach, right? If it doesn't meet our cost effectiveness, it's not going to be available. And it's an early experiment to see what happens. Do we get the prices down so that they can keep the broad access, or do we have drugs that are excluded? And how do we manage that kind of tension in the U.S. system? So I don't mean to overly stress that these are the right ways to move forward, but it's a sign that the market and the states feel the need to move forward. And so I think whatever does happen at the federal level, they may end up learning from these experiments. And I think we'll see a lot of change over the next year or 2.
Thanks, Steve. That is an interesting program. And they're grappling with it right now with the new drug that came out to treat migraine that's quite expensive. It doesn't meet their barrier, so we're watching that one
Actually.
closely. And so I think we'll wrap up now. It's been a great hour spending it with you. Before we go, I want to hear from everybody, 1 minute or less, your biggest concern and greatest hope moving forward. Let's start with Limor. You ready?
Yep, sure, absolutely. Biggest concern is those ultimately deciding what to cover and at what price won't be willing to make difficult trade-offs. Very exciting to hear that the state of New York is willing to give it a stab. We tend to be more willing to try these things out on our indigent populations. I'd like to see some more stringent activity on the commercial side, and what CVS is doing is promising. Greatest hope is that we will engage consumers more in selection of their health plans, selection of prescription drug plans, give them the option to select stricter formularies, and if they do so, then I think we'll see a market response.
So I live just outside of Washington, D.C., so I have lots of greatest fears. In this domain, it's that, and this is true in Europe, in Australia, wherever else you go, these issues around drug prices and access and costs and patient care, they're not easy. There's no system that feels like, oh, this is just a smooth process. We have a decision making. Everybody's happy at the end of the day. It requires the deepest effort of a society to really grapple honestly with trade-offs and with limitations around what we can spend and for whom. And that's never easy. And so my greatest fear is that at this particular moment in our political discourse and our public discourse, this will be really hard for us to handle. But my greatest hope is actually born out of some of our experience at public meetings, where we've seen patient groups really come to the table, not just for their piece of the pie, but seeing the bigger picture. And people starting to talk about this as an ongoing issue that we as Americans need to sort out, and hopefully in a way that will work for everybody, because cures are coming. You'll hear about them if you haven't already, but we're having some fantastic drugs nearing approval that will provide miraculous treatments for patients with long-term diseases like sickle cell, hemophilia. And if we don't figure this out, we're going to have a head-on train crash between price, cost, and access. So we have to get these systems and our dialogue sorted out, because we're going to have a great problem to deal with, which is cures for patients that we really want to help.
I guess my greatest fear is that the politics of Citizens United, which is money in politics, will come to dominate where we land and our solutions, because they often have in the past. My greatest hope is that we, I think, now have started to recognize how important competition is if we're going to have a market-driven system, and that we will sort of aggressively sweep away the things that get in the way of that right now, including, especially with on the biologic side.
Yeah, so my greatest fear also is that a lot of the things that we're talking about may require some legislative changes, grappling with patents, trying to evaluate the way that the government buys drugs, and that is problematic in the current, to get sort of these kinds of major things done in the current political environment, particularly when there is a extremely well-funded lobbying organization on the pharmaceutical industry side that is that actively opposes a lot of these kinds of changes. And so, but on the other hand, my greatest hope is the kinds of efforts that you see at the state level and that come out of patients, because there are surveys out there that 75% of patients think that drug prices are a big issue, and if we really see patients step forward and make their voices heard, I think that we can actually try to push through the gridlock.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Aaron, Richard, Stephen, Limor, for joining us today. Thank you to our audience and to our viewers. I'd like to encourage you to tune into our next forum. It is called Conflicts Over Science and Policy at the EPA. Where are we headed? That one will be October 19th from noon to 1 p.m., also at forumhsph.org. Thanks for joining us today.